welcome back. In this video we're going to kick off the skeletal chapter by talking about bones, and then we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the types of bones that we have in a vertebrate skeleton. So let's get into it. Now, a vertebrate skeleton is something that we're all familiar with. The reason we're able to stand upright is because we have a backbone, and another name for an internal skeleton is just called an endoskeleton. Endo usually refers to inside, and exo outside. Now, within the context of an endoskeleton, there are different ways to classify the bones that we do have. So if we take a look at the diagram on the left, this is going to represent an axial skeleton. And an axial skeleton just represents all of the bones that are the innermost bones, or the core bones. So when I think of the word axial, I think of axis, and usually that entails a straight line. So all of the bones that basically fall along the axis of the body are going to be axial bones. Whatever kind of diverges away from that middle axis is going to be a part of the appendicular skeleton. Also, the name kind of tells you that as well, because our appendages are made up of appendicular bones. Remember that. Okay, so let's get into the different types of bones that we have. You may already know that people have approximately 206 bones in their body, and all of those bones actually fall within these 5 categories. So first we have long bones, which tend to be our appendicular bones. If we take a look here, we can see that the longest bone in our body, the femur, is going to be a long bone. And long bones actually have a few features about them that make them particularly special. So in the next couple of slides, we'll go a little bit deeper into the anatomy of a long bone and why the features that it has are important. Just continuing on with the types that we also have short bones. As you can see, the naming in this chapter is pretty straightforward. So short bones are going to be exactly what they sound like. They're small bones that tend to be primarily square in shape. And a good example of where we have an abundance of short bones will be in our head, be called the metacarpals and the metatarsals. The next type of bone we have are flat bones. And these are going to be bones that are present in the sternum and the ribs, as well as some flat bones that we have in the skull. So if we have long, short, and flat, what shape is a sesamoid? Well, sesamoid bones are named after the shape of sesame seeds because they tend to have that shape, and they also tend to be small and nutty as well. The largest sesamoid bone that we have is actually the kneecap, and we'll talk about why its shape is actually really important in helping us extend the knee. Lastly, we have irregular bones. Any bone that doesn't fall into the above 4 categories will basically be an irregular bone. Since the classification of bones is based on shape, any shape that is pretty weird or wonky, like the vertebra of the spine or the hip bones in particular, these don't really have preset shapes, so we call them irregular. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the characteristics of long bones. Now in this chapter we're going to be talking a lot about 2 different qualities of bone. So particularly we have hard bone and soft bone. And long bones are particularly made up of that hard bone, which in biology we call cortical bone. And we can see that the long bone has this cortical bone surrounding it on the outside. Whereas on the inside we have a soft or spongy bone, and this we call cancellous bone. So you're going to see that a lot in this chapter. I'm going to try and interchange the terms that I use, so sometimes I'll say spongy instead of cancellous, just so that you get used to seeing all the different ways that you could possibly your test. And the features that we will pay attention to when it comes to the long bone are going to be the epiphyses. This is going to be plural, so we have 2 epiphyses of the long bone. The diaphysis, which is this middle region here, singular. The medullary cavity, which is inside the diaphysis. The metaphyses, which live in between the epiphysis and the diaphysis, and the epiphyseal plate. This exists somewhere between the epiphysis and the metaphysis, and we'll talk about the difference between the epiphyseal plate as well as the epiphyseal line that we see in this diagram. So let's take a brief look at each of these distinct features. So the epiphyses are going to be located at each end of the long bone. So in this diagram we can see that in a growing bone we have the epiphyses here, and in a mature bone we have it there. It's pretty easy to tell which part of the bone is the epiphysis because not only is it at the end, but it has this really weird shape at its head. This is usually because long bones tend to meet each other at joints at the epiphyses. And because the epiphyses are the surfaces involved in creating a joint, they're typically covered with something called articular cartilage. And the word articular just means that it has to do with a joint. So the articular cartilage is going to cover the epiphyses because they're part of synovial joints. It's also worth noting that the epiphyses contain red bone marrow as well. This is actually going to differ from the marrow that's contained in the diaphysis. And in order to hold all of that marrow, the epiphyses is full of spongy or cancellous bone that kind of sucks up the marrow like a sponge. The epiphyses will actually be a site of red blood cell production because red bone marrow is responsible for a process called hematopoiesis. which is simply the production of red blood cells. Now let's move on to the diaphysis. Unlike some other parts of the bone, there is only going to be one diaphysis, and it'll be this long, hollow region here. We'll see why I say hollow in a second. So the diaphysis is going to be the midsection of the bone, and it is primarily the part that allows us to bear our weight. Now, bones don't typically exist just regular and uncovered. Just like how we had the epiphysis covered in articular cartilage, we're also going to have a covering for the diaphysis, but it's going to be a thin membrane called the periosteum. Now, before I said the diaphysis was hollow, but this isn't really true. So the diaphysis is actually filled with, again, that spongy bone. We're basically going to see a trend where bones are kind of like sandwiches. There's going to be a thick outer crust and then some soft, spongy material inside. So again, we're going to have some more of that spongy or cancellous bone. And that's going to hold a different kind of marrow called yellow marrow inside of the medullary cavity. Now, when we're born, all of the bones in our body are filled with red marrow. And this makes sense, right? Because red marrow is responsible for the production of new blood cells, and there's a lot of growth that happens within the first few years of our lives. However, as we get older, particularly into adulthood, the red marrow in the medullary cavities start to get slowly replaced by yellow marrow. And yellow marrow is basically just fat. It's adipose tissue that starts to get produced within the bone. And this makes sense too because as the bones grow and they get larger, there's going to be an increased need to maintain the metabolism of those bones. And for the cells inside that produce the cartilage and that are responsible for mineralization, those need to be maintained. So over time, the bones start to begin to store fats as energy. And bones are actually very highly organized in their microstructures. So the medullary cavity is going to also be surrounded by a membrane. So similarly to how the periosteum protects the outer layer of the diaphysis, the medullary cavity is going to be protected by a membrane called the endosteum. It's kind of hard to visualize all these membranes. We're looking at a horizontal cross-section like this one. So if we take a look here, we can see that on the very inside of a long bone, we have the yellow marrow. And that yellow marrow is housed by the medullary cavity. Now, the medullary cavity is surrounded by that membrane called the endosteum. Outside of the endosteum is where we have that layer of cortical or hard bone. And on the very outside of the cortical bone, we have the periosteum, which helps protect that outside layer, and it provides innervation and a source of blood vessels for the bone. Metaphyses are going to be a region that is located in between the epiphysis and the diaphysis. And it actually plays a really important role in the growth of new bone. When we're younger, our bones are growing more. That's pretty much a given, right? And within the metaphysis, there's a structure called the epiphyseal plate, or the growth plate. And this is actually where we get the site of new bone growth. So let's not forget that the entire bone is alive. It's made up of some living tissue as well as some minerals. But the bone actually lengthens from the epiphyseal plate. So we can see this diagram here. The epiphyseal plate is kind of within the metaphysis and it extends to the epiphysis, but where growth is happening is really in the direction of the metaphysis. So if growth is happening in the direction of the metaphysis, which is in this direction, we can see how the diaphysis will in fact get longer as each epiphysis kind of pushes the other away from each other, thus lengthening the middle. It's kind of like pulling taffy, if you want to imagine that. Now, once we're going through puberty, we kind of have some hormonal changes, right? So that's actually going to slow down the growth of the epiphyseal plate through controlled cell death. So the cells that are producing the cartilage and that are also responsible for mineralizing the bone are going to be killed off in this process, so that eventually all we have left over is just a remnant of what was once the epiphyseal plate, and that's called the epiphyseal line. So that's how you can distinguish an adult long bone from a immature long bone, is that in one you'll see the epiphyseal plate, which signifies that that person is still growing, and in the other you will see an epiphyseal line, which signifies that puberty has already happened and growth of that bone has stopped. Now, the plate itself is made up of cartilage. Now, we'll talk more about this in later videos when we discuss more about how bone is formed, but bone is basically built off of a scaffolding of cartilage first, and then it becomes mineralized over time. And the cartilage that is mainly used to do this is called hyaline cartilage. Now, hyaline cartilage is going to be a term that you're going to see a lot in the skeletal unit. It's the primary type of cartilage that is associated with making new bones and maintaining bones. The articular cartilage that we talked about earlier in the chapter that goes over the tops of the epiphyses to protect the joints, those are also a type of hyaline cartilage. So that's how we know that it's going to be the main cartilage type in this chapter. Okay, so enough about long bones. Next we're going to talk about short bones, and they're pretty much straightforward. So short bones in particular are cuboidal, and this means that they're going to be cube-like, so they're just as long as they are tall. Their main function is to help provide support without necessarily doing a whole bunch of movement. So you're not really going to see a short bone in a joint, for example, but they will support the other bones around it. And just like the majority of other bones, short bones are going to be made up of a thin layer of cortical or hard bone surrounding the spongy or cancellous bone on the inside. And next up we have flat bones, which are exactly what they sound like. They're just going to be sheets of bone that are going to be made up of that hard cortical layer outside with the spongy bone located on the inside. Okay, so far we've had long bones, flat bones, and short bones. Now what exactly is a sesamoid shape? Well, sesamoid bones are actually named after sesame seeds because they're A, small, and B, they kind of resemble that oval shape of a sesame seed. And sesamoid bones are often observed in conjunction with muscles. So, for example, the largest sesamoid bone we have in our body is going to be the patella, or the kneecap. And the patella is located within a tendon on our knee, and what it does is it actually helps to increase the leverage that the quadriceps muscle has on pulling our leg up. It means that a muscle needs to be working in this direction to get the knee to extend outward. Because the kneecap is protruding out here, it acts as a lever. So just in case it's a little bit confusing, let's imagine what the knee would look like without the kneecap. So the quadriceps tendon helps to facilitate the contact between the quadriceps muscle and our femur. And as the quadriceps tendon extends over the kneecap, it starts to become the patellar tendon down here. Now if we imagine that the knee did not have the kneecap to act as a lever, when we want to go to extend our knee, the muscle is going to have to generate a lot of force to just pull upwards on our tibia. Whereas when we have the kneecap, we can kind of now see that there is a lever. The knee can now act as a fulcrum for the muscle to pull up and around over it and facilitate extension that way. And last but not least, we have irregular bones. And any bone that doesn't fall into the category of long, short, flat, or sesamoid is going to fall under the irregular category. And this is simply because we classify bones by shape. It's the easiest. And irregular bone is going to be just like the other ones. It's going to be made up of cancellous bone surrounded by cortical bone. However, we can easily see that there's going to be no template for how an irregular bone may look. We may have some irregular bones like the vertebrae in our spines, or we might have an irregular shape like the pelvis, or, for example, our tailbones. So irregular bones have very important and specific functions in the body, and that's why they tend to be unique in shape. Okay, so let's go over some of the key things that you need to take away from this video. So first we have to remember that spongy bone is also known as cancellous bone, and compact bone is going to be known as cortical bone. And next we should also remember that the abundance of bones in our body are basically classified by shape. So we could have long, short, flat, sesamoid, or irregular type of bones. Long bones are going to be the most special out of the group because they'll have a few features or microstructures that we need to pay attention to, simply because they're so important when it comes to growth and development. So long bones will have epiphyses, which are located at each end of the bone, as well as the long middle section called the diaphysis. Now while the diaphysis appears to be hollow, it's not going to be hollow at all. It's going to be filled with spongy bone as well as yellow bone marrow that fills the medullary cavity. The metaphyses are going to be located in between the epiphyses and the diaphysis, and it's going to be the part of the bone that is responsible for growth. So it actually houses the epiphyseal plate, which is also known as the growth plate. Hey everyone, welcome back. In this video we're going to talk a little bit about bone remodeling, and this is the process of simply just making bone and breaking it down. Now the maintenance of bone is actually really important to helping our body maintain homeostasis. So we're going to learn exactly how this is done by first looking at the microstructure of cortical or hard bone. So this is kind of going to give us a little bit of insight into the bone remodeling process, as well as the cells that are responsible for the actual remodeling process. So let's get into it. Okay, so there are basically two types of bone that we're going to be encountering throughout this unit. We'll have both cortical bone and cancellous bone. Now, cortical bone is going to be this outer layer of bone that we see here, whereas the spongy bone is going to be the stuff located inside that looks a little bit mushy. And the cortical bone layer is the outer layer of bone that basically helps us to support our weight. So in order to fully understand how bone is remodeled, we have to learn a little bit about the finer details or the microstructure of bone so that we can see what's going on and also know where bone cells are living and what they're doing. So in the next couple of slides, we're going to go a little bit deeper into structures such as osteons, Haversian canals, lamellae, lacunae, canaliculi, and Volkmann's canals. Let's get started with the osteon. The osteon is going to be a functional unit of bone. And by functional unit, we mean that this is a part of the bone that is able to carry out all of the functions necessary for that type of tissue. So for example, in biology, the cell is often called the functional unit of life, right? Because the cell is able to make its own food, reproduce, and basically be the building block for all life. Similarly to a cell, an osteon is a functional unit of the bone because it has all of the properties necessary for the bone to do its job. And we can see in the diagram here that we have all of these osteons that together make up the bone tissue. And within an osteon, we're going to notice a central area called a Haversian canal. And the point of a Haversian canal is to provide somewhere for blood vessels as well as nerves to innervate the bone.
Hi everyone, Kelton here to talk to you about Volkmann's canals. Volkmann's canals, which can be seen here, are these small transverse tunnels that end up connecting our adjacent Haversian canals to one another. In addition to this, Volkmann's canals are also going to connect our Haversian canals to the periosteum, which is going to end up supplying the bone with the blood and nutrients it needs to grow. And now back to Brianna.
Now, because bone is such thick tissue that's also made of, some of those hard mineral parts, it's going to be hard to run blood vessels freely throughout the bone. So that's why we have these organized networks of osteons with a Haversian canal in the middle so that the bones can receive both nourishment and a means for sensation. Now, who are the blood vessels actually providing for here? Well, we have all of these little gray dots here that you can see. And those represent bone cells that live in these little trenches within the bone called lacunae. And lacunae are just basically little spaces within bone that actually house the bone cells. So in this diagram here, we have an osteon. And we'll notice that within the osteon, we have these little concentric circles, kind of like a tree ring. And these concentric circles are going to be called the lamellae. And lamellae are just simply the layers of osteon that have built up over time. Now, within the osteon, we do have these lacunae where the osteocytes live. And in order for them to actually receive the nutrients from the Haversian canal, which is in the middle here, the nutrients that are brought by these blood vessels have to find a way to reach even the far out bone cells that live in the other layers. And they do this by these little canaliculi, these radiating layers that come out from the center of the Haversian canal, and they help to nourish all of the bone cells that are located in those lacunae along the way. Alright, so cortical bone aside, we're going to talk about cancellous bone now. And cancellous bone is going to be that spongy bone that we talked about before. And whenever you see these networks of these little tendrils or this maze-like texture within bone, that's going to be spongy bone. And those little tendrils are specifically called trabeculae. The trabeculae are weaved together and they kind of act like the same netting in a sponge. The trabeculae help to soak up red bone marrow and keep it held within the bone. And the whole purpose of red blood marrow is to produce red blood cells. And this is done in a process called hematopoiesis. Okay, so what about the bone cells that actually live within the osteons? What are they doing? Well, first up, we've got osteoblasts. And osteoblasts are responsible for building bone. So if you'll notice, the osteoblasts will be these little guys here. And if you'll notice, they'll have one dot in the center of their cells in this diagram. And that's just simply to represent that they are mononucleated cells and that they only have one nucleus. And osteoblasts actually go through a life cycle while they're in the bone. So first off, they come from precursor cells called osteoprogenitors. And once these osteoprogenitors mature, they become osteoblasts, which are then capable of building up bone matrix. Now, while osteoclasts are doing their job and they're building more and more and more bone, something that actually happens is that they can become trapped by all of the bone that they've been building. And this actually leads them to the next phase in their life cycle in which they become osteocytes. They no longer really contribute to more bone growth, but instead they communicate with other bone cells to kind of direct the process. So they take on more of a directorial role once they become stuck in the bone matrix. And a great way to remember exactly what osteoblasts are doing is that you can remember that osteoblasts build bone. Okay, so osteoblasts are actually pretty cool because they're capable of making both the organic and inorganic components of bone. So when bone is formed, first it kind of starts off as a more flexible matrix made out of organic materials such as proteins as well as collagen. And once that initial bone matrix is built, then we start to get enzymes that are released to start the mineralization process. So once that begins, we get the actual ossification or the hardening of bone where we get the inorganic materials like calcium. So the organic portion of the bone matrix that's made up of the protein and the collagen is going to be called osteoid. whereas the inorganic component that's made up of phosphorus, calcium, and water is going to be called hydroxyapatite. So honestly, when it comes to the skeletal system, the osteoblasts kind of carry bone formation on their backs because they're able to produce both the inorganic and the organic components of bone. So they're kind of like a one-stop shop for bone building. While we have cells that are capable of building bone, we also have cells that are capable of breaking down bone on the other hand. And these are going to be the osteoclasts. And osteoclasts are going to be a little bit different functionally from osteoblasts, simply because they're going to be multinucleated cells as opposed to the osteoblasts, which only have one nuclei. We can see that there are a bunch more dots in those little osteoclasts there. And osteoclasts are multinucleated in part because they are derived from immune cells called monocytes. And if you're not already familiar with that term, a monocyte is simply just an immune cell, and it typically happens to be a white blood cell. And when I think of monocytes, I think of a type of white blood cell called macrophages, which are basically just like the garbage can of the immune system. You know, they have very high phagocytic activity, meaning they're able to just eat up any debris. So it's not really so much of a leap to think of osteoclasts in that vein as well, because they do a similar role of chewing up bone. And during this resorption process where they're doing that, osteoclasts actually start to dig their own little trenches or their own little lacunae. And they're actually quite distinct because they're made from these osteoclasts that are literally burrowing into bone and digesting it away. And those special lacunae that they have are called Hauschup's lacunae. So now that we have osteoblasts and clasts, we know that bones are basically fluctuating between states of ossification or bone building, as well as resorption or the breaking down of bone. But what is actually controlling this? Well, this is where the endocrine system steps in. As we know, the endocrine system is responsible for a lot of hormonal signaling, and it basically directs all of our different processes within our metabolism to maintain a baseline homeostasis. And bone remodeling is important for homeostasis not only because remodeling affects the structural integrity of bones, but the minerals that get released from our bones can be useful in times of need, or we may use the bones as storage for minerals that are too abundant in our blood. And the remodeling process is controlled by parathyroid hormone, vitamin D, and calcitonin. So let's get into how each of these really helps with that. So first up, we've got parathyroid hormone, or PTH, which is secreted by the parathyroid gland. Now, parathyroid hormone is going to be recruited specifically in times where there is low blood calcium. So its purpose then is to increase blood calcium levels. So let's take a closer look at the diagram here. Now, the parathyroid gland is going to secrete PTH, which is parathyroid hormone. Now, parathyroid hormone acts when calcium is low in the blood, and it serves to increase blood calcium levels by stimulating osteoclast activity and depressing osteoblast activity. And the reason why we have to both increase osteoclast activity and depress osteoblast activity is because we want to get the net increase of calcium in the blood. And if we still have the osteoblasts working at 100% capacity, they're just going to build that calcium right back into the bone. So we need to make sure that, relatively speaking, we have higher levels of osteoclast activity so that we can really benefit from that calcium release and restore homeostasis. Vitamin D is going to be working in tandem with parathyroid hormone. So when parathyroid hormone is released, we get vitamin D being synthesized in the liver. And what vitamin D does is that it increases calcium resorption in the intestines. So we've talked about resorption in terms of bone. When bone is broken down, it's basically resorbed. In this case, calcium is going to be resorbed from the intestines. So what vitamin D will do is that it will promote calcium uptake from any food that is passing through the digestive tract so that it can be absorbed back into the blood. And curiously enough, because vitamin D is activated by PTH and it's serving to increase blood calcium levels through this resorption process, it actually is going to feed back additionally to the parathyroid gland. So if both vitamin D and PTH successfully raise blood calcium levels, vitamin D will kind of be a signal for the parathyroid gland to chill out and stop producing as much PTH. So in order to maintain homeostasis, we don't ever want one reaction going out of control. If we have a mechanism that's meant to increase blood calcium when it's low, we don't want it to increase blood calcium and then keep increasing blood calcium. It has to be able to shut itself off as well. Additionally, something that helps with that is going to be calcitonin, which is released from the thyroid gland. And calcitonin is going to oppose both PTH and vitamin D and lower blood calcium levels. So if calcium in the blood is high, we get calcitonin activity. And the way that calcitonin tones down the calcium levels in the blood is that it is going to recruit osteoblasts to do their job. It's going to have them kick up their bone building activity so they can siphon that calcium from the blood and have it stored into the bone. And relatively, we're also going to have the osteoclast activity decreased as well, for the same reason as before. You don't want all that calcium that's being stored in the blood to just be kicked right back out by the osteoclasts who are chewing away bone. So calcitonin will be successful in lowering blood calcium by managing the activity of osteoclasts and blasts. So hopefully now we can see how important bone remodeling is in maintaining our homeostasis. Not only is it important for, the structural integrity of our skeleton and making sure that we're upright and able to move safely, but it's also responsible for helping balance mineral concentrations within our blood. Minerals like calcium and phosphorus that we get in our diet, if those are too high, then we get them stored back in the bone. Just like how glucose can be stored in multiple places in our body, like the liver, the fat cells, and our muscles, we also need a storage deposit for minerals as well, and that's what the bones provide us. It's also worth noting that if we have any issues with, the balance of osteoblast and osteoclast activity, and we basically have dysregulation of this bone remodeling process, we can have some disorders like osteoporosis. People who have this condition typically have an unhealthy bone structure. So as we can see in the picture here, a healthy bone matrix looks like this. There's a lot of different branching and connection between the pieces of bone, whereas an unhealthy or diseased bone, like in people with osteoporosis, the bone matrix is very fragile. There's not very much structural integrity there, and as a result, the bones become brittle and they become susceptible to breakage. Okay, so let's just summarize everything that we've talked about in this video into the key points that you should remember. So first, we've got the difference between cancellous and cortical bone. And cortical bone is going to have these little microstructures that'll be really important in helping us understand how bone is made. The functional unit of cortical bone is going to be an osteon, and the osteon is going to have a few structures within it, including that central canal that houses all the blood vessels and nerves, called the Haversian canal. And we've also got the lamellae, which are the layers of the osteon, the lacunae, which are the homes for the bone cells. Canaliculi connect the lacunae so that they can receive nutrients, and the Volkmann canals just simply connect the Haversian canals between adjacent osteons together. We're going to have the osteoclasts chewing up bone, as well as the osteoblasts building bone. And lastly, we'll have to remember that the bone remodeling process is really important for helping us maintain homeostasis, and it's controlled by PTH, vitamin D, and calcitonin. Hey everyone, welcome back. In this video, we're going to dive deep into how bones are made. Now, the process of bone formation or ossification begins in utero. And as we know, bones come in different shapes, qualities, and sizes. So there's going to be different processes used to make these bones. For example, a long bone like your femur is not necessarily going to be made in the same way like a flat bone in your sternum. So we're going to talk about the two types of ossification that happens in utero, which include intramembranous ossification as well as endochondral ossification. So let's get into it. First, we're going to talk about intramembranous ossification, and this is the method by which flat bones are made. So the first thing that we'll need to know is that with intramembranous ossification, bone is made directly within a fibrous membrane. And what does that mean? Well, you can either make a bone directly, as in getting the osteoblasts to deposit hardened, mineralized bone right from the beginning, or you can start off with a model and then ossify it or harden it later. And in this case, we're going to do the former. So as you may remember, the bone cells that are responsible for building bone are going to be those osteoblasts. And the osteoblasts are going to secrete that collagen and protein matrix called osteoid. And this is basically what the hard, mineralized component of bone is going to be attached to. And as we may also remember, when osteoblasts are creating all this bone matrix, they can get stuck in it eventually. And that's when they enter the next phase in their life cycle and they become osteocytes. So let's take a look at the diagram so we can actually see what's going on here. So first we're going to have the osteoblasts congregating within an osteoid, which is just that functional unit of cortical bone. And that is referred to as an ossification center, since that's where, ossification is actually going to take place. Now, when it comes to mesenchymal cells and the mesenchyme in general, mesenchyme is kind of like a primordial soup of embryonic fluids and tissues. So those are basically going to be stem cells that are going to differentiate into whatever the fetus needs. And we'll learn about what it actually becomes in a couple of slides. The osteoblasts are congregating in the osteoid. We've got the ossification center going. The mesenchymal cells are just hanging out there getting ready to do their job. As the osteoblasts are starting to build bone, we're getting more bone matrix that's being made, and that's going to be this yellow substance in here. And we can see that these osteocytes, these big cells in the middle, are getting trapped within that bone matrix that they're making. The next step is that the matured osteoblasts, which are now osteocytes, are going to make trabeculae. And this is that component of spongy bone that has all of those holes in it. So we can see here that all of this tan in the diagram is going to be the trabeculae that forms. And the trabeculae that we talked about is going to be referred to in this part of the process as woven bone, just because it simply has that woven texture that looks a little bit porous. We can also notice as the osteocytes are making the trabeculae and building more actual bone structure, the mesenchymal cells that were kind of spaced out before are starting to get more organized. So like I said before, those mesenchymal stem cells are going to start arranging themselves into the periosteum. And it's also worth noting that at this point in time, we're starting to get some vascularization. So we're seeing blood vessels that are starting to come into the trabeculae and help to support the cells that are rapidly building bone. And once we have the woven bone and the blood vessels in the center here, we can see that the overall thickness of the bone has increased. And while we have this woven bone in the center here, we also have this thick region of compact bone on either side. So the bone literally gets built from the inside out in this way, and that's how we get the spongy interior along with a hard, compact exterior. And we can find the osteoblasts doing their job on the outside, as well as the periosteum that has fully formed and is now covering that compact bone. And here's another view of a flat bone in perhaps a more familiar diagram. We have the compact or cortical bone sandwiching that spongy bone on the inside, and intramembranous ossification makes it so that we build this bone from the inside out. On the other hand, we have endochondral ossification, and this type of bone formation tends to happen in long bones. So in this case, the bones are created indirectly, meaning that we kind of start with a template and then we get the ossification happening later on. So while an embryo is developing within the mother's stomach, we first get a model of the bones made out of cartilage. And this happens within the 8th week of development, so it actually happens pretty early on. Now, after around 12 weeks in development, we start to get the primary ossification center, and that's represented by this little dot on the inside there. So within the cartilage model, we start to get ossification happening from the inside out, kind of similarly to how in intramembranous ossification we got that spongy bone, and then it became flanked by that compact bone. In a similar sense, we're getting it built from the inside out here, but again, we have this model that we're starting from, not just scratch. And with the primary ossification center, we get the formation of the periosteum on the outside of the diaphysis, as well as this little tan region here just below the periosteum. That's going to be called the bone collar. So that's just an ossified section that's helping to support the middle as it ossifies also from the inside out. And also around 12 weeks, we start to get some vascularization. So we get some blood vessels coming in to nourish those osteoblasts that are working really hard to build bone matrix. As the fetus continues to develop, we're going to notice that we're having some ossification happening at the epiphyses of the bone. And these are going to be called secondary ossification centers, simply because they're happening second. And what's happening is that now we're getting bone formation at the epiphyses. So not only are we building bone from the inside out, but we're starting to get bone made here and here. And by the time the fetus is nearing the time where it's going to be born, we get the formation of the medullary cavity. And this is happening because of osteoclast activity. And the inside cavity that was previously just all bone is going to get eaten away by osteoclasts. And we can see this hollow cavity here that wasn't there before. And this is going to be the medullary cavity that houses bone marrow. Specifically in infants, it's going to house red bone marrow, but later on in life it gets replaced by yellow marrow. Once the child is born and we can see a fully formed long bone, it starts to look a little bit more familiar to us. We have that spongy bone in the epiphysis, as well as the blood vessels in the diaphysis and the medullary cavity as well. We can also see the cortical bone on the outside with that thick layer, and we know that the periosteum is located on the outside of that cortical bone, just it's really thin so we can't see it. Endochondral ossification is a much more organized and stepwise manner of forming bones, which makes sense if we consider that making a bone lengthwise is going to be a little bit more difficult than simply making a flat bone. So let's just break down what's going on in each process and look at them side by side so that we can really parse through the differences and maybe even the similarities. So with endochondral ossification, we first get that hyaline cartilage being formed. And if you're kind of having trouble remembering the difference between the two, endochondral kind of reminds me of cartilage because the cells that make cartilage are called chondrocytes. So that's how you know that cartilage is going to be involved with this type of ossification. So we get that hyaline cartilage model and it starts to calcify, forming a little bone collar as well as some bone being formed in the very center of that model. Next, the primary ossification center pops up at around the 12th week of development, and this is when we start to get the osteoblasts really going with building bone, as well as the appearance of blood cells within that inner cavity. Secondary ossification takes place a little bit later once those osteoblasts reach the epiphyses of the long bone, and they start to make spongy bone within that cavity. And lastly, osteoclasts are then going to chew out the bone that was made in the center of the diaphysis and create the medullary cavity where bone marrow is going to be stored. On the other hand, intramembranous ossification is a little bit more straightforward. So first we're going to have osteoblasts secreting osteoid, which is just that bone matrix made up of collagen and proteins. And then osteocytes within that bone matrix are going to start laying down actual bone, that hydroxyapatite mineral substance. And then that spongy bone is going to get wrapped by a periosteum, which serves to help protect it, as well as provide a source for blood vessels and nerves to get there. And lastly, as we're having the bone grow from the inside out, we're going to get the cortical bone located at the very exterior so that we end up having kind of like a bone sandwich with the cortical bone on the outside and the spongy bone on the inside. So just to summarize the key points that we've talked about in this video so far, with endochondral ossification, we should remember that chondral is associated with chondrocytes, and chondrocytes make cartilage. So endochondral ossification is going to start with that cartilage model. This is going to be primarily how long bones are formed. Conversely, intramembranous ossification is going to be how flat bones are made. And what happens is that the bone is created directly from that osteoid. It doesn't have to have any sort of model or precursor to help shape it. It just forms directly. The osteoblasts just directly deposit bone into that osteoid matrix. Hey everyone, welcome back. In this video, we're going to be focusing on connective tissue. We're going to focus on a few different types of connective tissue, but we're going to focus a little bit more on joints. And we're also going to talk about what this connective tissue is made of. And that's notably going to be cartilage, so we'll talk about the different types and, where we're likely to see them in this unit. So let's get into it. So connective tissues have the big job of basically holding our entire bodies together. And some really good examples of connective tissue that we may already be familiar with are tissues like tendons, which connect muscle to bone, as well as ligaments, which connect bone to bone. So we can see here that this would be a ligament because we have these two pieces of bone being connected by that connective tissue here, as well as the tendon, which is having that muscle connect to the bone in white there. Now there are other types of connective tissue that are specific just to bone itself, and we've talked about the periosteum a bunch. And we know that it covers the outside of the diaphysis in long bones. It provides a place for blood vessels and nerves to reach the bone. And lastly, we also have the endosteum, which is another membrane, but it's located inside the bone. So this is going to be the membrane that houses the medullary cavity. And it's going to be smack in the middle of the cancellous bone and the cortical bone on the outside. Since this is the skeletal chapter, let's talk a little bit more about the periosteum and the endosteum. So again, the periosteum is going to be that protective membrane that covers the diaphysis of cortical bones. And it's important that we denote that it's covering the diaphysis because we have to remember that at the epiphysis of long bones, or rather the epiphyses of long bones, we're going to have that articular hyaline cartilage helping to cushion the interaction that we have between those long bones. So there's hyaline cartilage at the epiphyses, and then there's the periosteum around the diaphysis. Now, because the periosteum is this outer layer here, we often have to really zoom in to see what's going on. So actually, the periosteum is a layered structure. So there are some sublayers of the periosteum that have slightly different functions. The very outermost layer of the periosteum is called the fibrous layer. And this is where we get the blood vessels and the nerves, as well as the thick weaving of fibrous tissue to help protect that bone. And then the very inner layer that kind of has these little cells dotted throughout is going to be called the inner layer. It can also be called the cambium or the cellular layer. And this is where cells are going to be found in the periosteum. Osteoprogenitor cells, which are the precursors to osteoblasts, are going to be hanging out within the collagen matrix that's present in the inner layer of the periosteum. That's why we see the cortical bone is so intimately pressed up against the periosteum, because the periosteum literally holds the precursor cells to osteoblasts. And then again, once osteoblasts produce enough bone, enough to get trapped by it, they become osteocytes, and the process just keeps going on and on. Now, if we really zoom into the spongy bone that exists in the epiphyses, we're going to see a different type of membrane. This is going to be the endosteum. The endo meaning that it's going to be inside. And the endosteum is going to cover the area where there is a lot of spongy bone. This is going to be the border or the lining of the medullary cavity. It's also worth noting that we see an endosteum layer within other structures within the osteon as well. So a Haversian canal is going to be the center of an osteon. This is where the blood vessels come in the very center of that osteon. That canal is lined by an endosteum. Same thing with the Volkmann canals that connect osteons. They're going to be lined by this endosteum membrane. And both the periosteum and the endosteum have a role in regulating bone growth as well as bone remodeling. So these structures do play some functional roles in bone maintenance. So let's talk a little bit about cartilage. Cartilage has a really multifunctional role when it comes to bones. We have cartilage that is lining our joints and cushioning bones from rubbing against each other, as well as cartilage that is the precursor of bones. So for example, when we have endochondral ossification, we have to first make a model of the long bone out of cartilage before it's ossified later. And cartilage is interesting because it's a very important structural component, but it doesn't really have a way of getting nutrients easily. So it's going to be a substance that's avascular, meaning that it doesn't have any blood vessels in it at all whatsoever. And by extension, it's not going to be innervated either. So nerves aren't running through pieces of cartilage that you have. And that's actually kind of crazy because cells make cartilage. Although cartilage is a structure and it doesn't have blood vessels or innervation, cartilage is made by cells called chondroblasts. And they live within the cartilage that they build, kind of like osteoblasts. And because these cells don't have any sort of vascularization, chondrocytes basically just rely on any nutrients that are within the extracellular fluid that surround the cartilage in our joints. So that's actually why when we injure a part of our body that has a lot of cartilage in it, like for example, if you get your cartilage pierced in your ear, it's going to take a little bit longer to heal because you have to wait for those immune cells as well as the nutrients in the blood to literally diffuse into fluid before reaching the cartilage. Because again, blood isn't just going to go there and help fix the problem. And chondroblasts kind of remind me of osteoblasts. I feel like in this chapter, whenever we have any sort of blast, it's going to be something that's building. So chondroblasts are going to build cartilage, and similarly to osteoblasts, they can actually get trapped within the cartilage that they make. And when they do that, they become chondrocytes. In the same way that osteoblasts become osteocytes once they're trapped in bone matrix. And once chondrocytes become trapped, they basically take on a directorial role. They'll help direct other chondroblasts to make cartilage wherever else. And the locations where chondrocytes get trapped are going to be called cartilaginous lacunae. Now, cartilage is made up of two main types of protein. Now, collagen is actually the most abundant protein in animals, period. It's one of the proteins that literally help to hold each of our cells together. And the property that collagen imparts to cartilage is that it gives it some rigidity. And while the other component of cartilage, which is called elastin, it's going to do basically what its name suggests. It's going to make the cartilage a little bit stretchy and elastic. Cartilage kind of needs to be that way a little bit, right? Because if we're going to have it be in between bones, there are sometimes a lot of forces generated within joints. Even just jumping up and down, you're putting a lot of pressure on the joints in your knee, and those bones are going to be crashing together. Cartilage needs to be a little bit springy as well as rigid in order to accommodate for all the different types of movement that we can do. Now, the quality of cartilage is going to depend on the relative ratio of elastin to collagen. We have three cartilage types that vary in this way. We have hyaline cartilage, fibrous cartilage, and elastic cartilage. We'll get into these types in the next few slides. So hyaline cartilage is going to be the more popular one that we're talking about in this unit. It's going to be the cartilage that covers the ends of long bones. And something cool about hyaline cartilage is that it's supposed to be very glass-like. So if we take a look at the diagram, we can see that in an artist's rendition, there's a lot of space in between the chondrocytes that produce it. And in this microscope image, we can kind of see that. The chondrocytes are going to be those little circles, but there's a lot of space in between them. And so once you shine the light on it, you get to see that space almost like stained glass. And hyaline cartilage contains both elastin and collagen, and it also contains a unique structural component called chondroitin sulfate. And hyaline cartilage, aside from what we know about the bones in our joints, it's also found in the nose, so the cartilage that gives your nose its shape, as well as in your trachea and the area between your ribs and sternum. So it helps to cushion those bones there as well. Now, fibrous cartilage is going to be tougher than its hyaline and elastic counterparts, and that's because it's going to have a higher proportion of collagen fibers within it. Now, fibrous cartilage has to be so strong because it has a big job to do. It's mostly present in areas in the body that take a beating. Fibrous cartilage is going to be present in the discs between your vertebrae. The spine is under compression all the time, just holding your weight under the force of gravity, as well as the twisting, that we do once we move freely. And as well, we're going to have a lot of fibrous cartilage in the knee. That is also a joint that experiences a lot of force generated on it. And lastly, we have elastic cartilage. This is going to be the opposite of fibrous cartilage in that it has a higher proportion of elastin. So this is going to be really stretchy, flexible tissue. We can see that in an artist's depiction of this, there's a lot of space like with hyaline cartilage, but we have the elastic fibers kind of weaving in within that matrix and making it very stretchy. It's a little harder to see in the picture, but you can kind of see these little wisps of the elastic fibers. And this is the cartilage that's actually found in your ear, and it's also found in the epiglottis, which is the flap that covers your trachea when you're eating. And that's a structure that has to be really flexible in order to kind of flap back and forth. So that's probably a more helpful example of why elastic cartilage is important than the ear. So joints are actually a type of connective tissue. If you think about it, joints do connect different bones together, so I guess it's not really that much of a stretch. But unlike cartilage, joints are going to have blood vessels in them, and the ability to have nerves run through them as well. And we have a few different classifications of joints based on the mobility that they provide. So first we have fibrous joints, which are called synarthroses. And because these are densely fibrous joints, we're not going to see much movement in them. So these are going to be immobile joints. An example of a fibrous joint like this is going to be the joints that hold the different sections of our skull together. It's important to have these immobile and strong fibrous joints to hold these pieces together because there is no reason for it to move, and thus it does its job. We're also going to have cartilaginous joints. So remember how we talked about the fibrous cartilage? These are going to be parts of cartilaginous joints like in between the discs in our spine. These types of joints are going to be called amphiarthroses. And again, since joints are classified by their ability to move, cartilaginous joints are going to be a little bit mobile, but a little bit rigid. And lastly, we have the most common type of joint, which is a synovial joint. And synovial joints are also known as diarthroses. These are the joints that I'm sure we're most familiar with, the joints that are in our hands, our arms, etc. These are going to be fully mobile, and this is what allows us to have the most range of movement in our bodies. Now we're going to focus more on the synovial joints because the other ones are actually kind of straightforward, and also synovial joints have a lot of diversity to them. Every time we talked about the epiphyses of long bones meeting at joints and the fact that they're covered with articular hyaline cartilage, we've basically been describing synovial joints this whole time. So synovial joints are the most common type of joint in our body, and they come in a bunch of different shapes and sizes. We can have pivot joints, which would be like the joint within our necks. This is going to be what allows our necks to pivot in a side-to-side way. We also have hinge joints with our elbows. So this is what allows our elbows to move up and down, and we can extend and contract our arms accordingly. We can also have saddle joints. And the joint is named just because it kind of looks like this top piece of the joint is sitting in a saddle as it, is cupped by that bottom piece. And saddle joints are pretty flexible. So a good example of that would be in our thumb. We can move our thumb both up and down or, extension and flexion, and we can also move it side to side. So we have a lot of range of movement just with this one type of joint. Plane joints are also called sliding joints, and this tends to be the type of joint that connects flat bones. So if we consider the bones in our hand in this flat part here, as we move our hands, you can't really see it here, but the flat bones that comprise our hand actually slide past each other to allow for the entire movement of the hand. We can also have condylar joints like the ones that exist in our wrist that connect our wrist to our radius and our ulna in the arm. Condylar joints allow for movement in an elliptical type of way. So you can have both flexion and extension, you can have a side-to-side movement which is adduction and adduction, and you can also have a circular movement here that a lot of our other joints can't really do. And lastly, we have the ball and socket joint. Now, this is arguably the most flexible joint in your body, but it's also the most unstable. The ball is being held in its portion of the socket by a complex network of tendons and ligaments, and so with extended movement of that joint, it's really easy to tear those supporting structures, and what that can lead to is dislocation. So the ball and socket joint is pretty easy to injure, even though it has the most capability of movement. And that's actually why baseball players tend to get injuries in their shoulder because they are using their ball and socket joints way too much. And even though it has the highest range of movement, which is probably needed for a pitcher, it's also not a type of joint that's incredibly resilient. So although synovial joints can come in a variety of conformations, which all give different ranges of movements, they tend to have the same basic components. So first you're going to just have the bones that you're, trying to create joints with. And then on the epiphyses of those bones, we'll have articular cartilage. Now, something that helps keep joints stable, especially when you have two bones that need to be in contact with each other, is that you need ligaments to keep the bones themselves together in the same place. An interesting thing about synovial joints is that they have their own type of fluid. It's a very slippery substance that helps to reduce the friction that the bones feel against each other. So even though we have the hyaline cartilage, that's not really enough to account for the fact that human beings have their bones grinding against each other for 70 plus years of their life. So you need to have something that kind of makes that process a little bit easier, and synovial fluid is the answer. Joint cavities tend to be full of synovial fluid, and then to keep all of that fluid inside the joint cavity, we have to have a capsule that's made up of a fibrous tissue that keeps all of that fluid inside. And a fun fact is that the sound of our bones cracking is actually made by this synovial fluid. Let me explain. So as we can see here, the synovial fluid takes up the entire cavity that is between the two bones within the joint. So what happens when we crack our bones is that we kind of pull the bones apart a little bit and we increase the volume here within this joint cavity. And the fluid that's within the joint cavity can't really keep up and fill that gap immediately. So what happens is that gas molecules that are dissolved within the synovial fluid immediately leave the fluid, and that process of the gas escaping the synovial fluid is called cavitation, and that cavitation process is what makes the popping sound. So it's kind of like we're listening to one big gas bubble pop in our joints every time we do it, and that's pretty cool. Alright, so let's just distill some of the key information that we took from this video. So first we have to remember that we have different types of connective tissues. Connective tissues have a huge role in literally keeping us together when we can't keep it together ourselves, and that's awesome. So fibrous connective tissue is going to be examples like tendons, which connect muscle to bone, as well as ligaments, which connect bone to bone. I personally used to get really confused when it came to the difference between them, but something that helps me is to remember the word ligature, and that is a word that means that something is being tied together. And ligament sounds like ligature, so I think of tying bones to each other. So maybe that can help with some sort of alliteration so that you can at least know the definition of one, and then you can get the other just by deduction. Secondly, we should know a little bit about cartilage, mainly that it's going to be avascular, and that's produced by cartilage cells called chondroblasts. There are going to be three types of cartilage that are prevalent in bone and connective tissue. The first being hyaline cartilage that is found in our joints, as well as elastic and fibrous cartilage that helps to provide both support and flexibility in their respective situations. And lastly, we should remember that synovial joints are going to be the most common joint in our body, and they're filled with that synovial fluid, as well as some protective cushioning by articular hyaline cartilage.